So thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thank you all for coming out. I actually wanted to open up by making a brief observation about the structure of this program, which I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it reflects the Gemara in Kiddushin, which records a debate as to which one is better, Talmud or Ma'aseh, learning or practice. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon have this debate, and Rabbi Tarfon says, anybody know? Rabbi Tarfon says, Talmud, study is better. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, practice is better. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Rabbi Tarfon says, I apologize. Rabbi Tarfon says that Ma'aseh, that practice is better. And Rabbi Akiva said, no, Talmud is better. And why? Why is Talmud better? Because Talmud leads to action. So the structure of this program, where we have a class followed by a more activist-oriented presentation, reflects that Gemara. And while there are certainly cases where Torah can be purely lishma, purely for its own sake, where it's theoretical, it's academic, it's intellectually and spiritually stimulating, in this context, it would seem to me that the Torah which is being taught tonight and this week has to inspire, it has to lead directly to action. And I wanted to quote Martha Nussbaum, who's a prominent American philosopher and actually a convert to Judaism. She said in a New York Times interview a number of years ago, it's an amazing interview, I encourage you to look it up. She said, for any view you put forward, the next question simply has to be, what would the world be like if this idea were actually taken up? So I think it's fair to ask the lecturers and the teachers in this program, do the ideas, do the interpretations, do the texts that we're presenting actually carry the potential to make a real difference in the world? And in my case, I know that at least on a personal level, the answer is yes, because these ideas actually did make a difference in how I did things. I started studying the Prophecies of Amos when I was in graduate school, and I was on my way to give a presentation in a course I was taking, and of course I was running late and found myself passing a homeless man on the street begging for food. And I passed him, I ran down the subway stairs, I almost swiped my card, and I stopped. And I went back upstairs, I bought the man a sandwich, and of course I was late to my presentation. And the thing that stopped me was the thought that I was literally about to present the ideas and the words of a prophet who would have found it impossible to pass somebody hungry on the street begging for food. And he would have railed against somebody like me who was blindly, mindlessly going about my business, and ironically, about to learn Torah, about to learn his Torah, and without actually doing something, without actually instantiating his prophecies. So it was what I called my Amos moment, and my prayer is that this week of lectures and presentations inspires numerous Amos moments for me, for all of us, individually, collectively, and that we actually use this Torah to make the world a better place. So with that background, let's dive in. I wanted to focus today on a biblical theme that comes up most prominently in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, where the prophet persistently attacks ritual. The prophet says to us, he rejects ritual, attacks ritual, condemns ritual, and says God does not want ritual. Rather, what does God want? God wants social justice. God wants purer worship, better obedience. And we just read this on Yom Kippur, where Yeshayahu says, "Hachazeh yatzom evcharehu." Is this the fast that I want? Yom anot adam nafsho, a day where a person afflicts his soul. And it's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Rather, Yeshayahu continues and says, what kind of day do I want? I want a fast where pateach chartzubot resha, where halo paros laraev lachmecha. I want a day where the fetters of wickedness are broken and where hungry people are fed. And turning from the book of Yeshayahu to the book of Amos, to the texts that we're going to study together, carries special significance. Amos prophesied in the 8th century BCE. He prophesied in the north of Israel. Remember that at that point, there were two kingdoms. There was a north called Israel and a south called Yehudah. Good. And so Amos was probably one of the first prophets to actually formulate this anti-ritual polemic, this attack on ritual, and he does so in a particularly radical and extreme way. So with that in mind, let's turn to the first source on your sheets. And can I have a volunteer to read? Let's read it in the English. So there's no excuses for not volunteering. Joe, thank you.
I loathe, I spurn your festivals. I'm not appeased by your solemn assemblies.
Yeah, read through the entire source.
Burnt offerings or your meal offerings, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to your gift of fatness. Spare me the sound of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes. But let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. Did you offer sacrifice and oblation to me those 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel?
Great, thank you. Okay, so what I want to focus on first are these verbs of rejection. God starts by saying, I hate, I despise your holidays. And it's pretty significant. I mean, number one, the language itself is, of course, very strong, that we're calling upon God's emotional apparatus in order to describe his rejection of ritual. And it's also significant because beforehand in Amos, we read about, we see the word hate coming up over and over again. The people hate justice. The people hate justice instead of hating evil. What do the people love? The people love these public celebrations of ritual, these public sacrificial feasts. So what God is saying is, I hate your festivals, I hate your sacrifices. Why? Because you hate justice. Moreover, if you pay attention to some of the other verbs of rejection, we see things like, I am not appeased. I don't think that's actually the best translation. Velo ariach. What does the word ariach call to mind? I don't smell. What typically does God do with sacrifices? Or, I don't want to say, take that too literally or anthropomorphically, but typically we describe sacrifices as reach nichoach laHashem. It's a sweet aroma. Here God is saying, no, I'm not smelling them. I don't want them. I'm not seeing your sacrifices. So it's the verbs which we usually use to signify God's acceptance of sacrifice, here we're seeing used as God's rejection of sacrifice. And God is saying, take them away. Take your prayers and your songs away from them. I don't hear them. Some of this might actually be familiar to you. Does anybody recognize Pasuk Kaf Daled? V'yagel kamayim mishpat utzedakah k'nachal eitan. Verse 24. But let justice well up like water. Sound familiar to anybody? Martin Luther King Jr. actually quotes this in some of his writings, not that surprisingly. Now in Amos talks about how righteousness and justice, remember those are two terms that often go together in Tanakh, justice and righteousness. Beforehand, Amos talks about how the people of Israel take justice and righteousness and they hurl it to the ground and they turn it to wormwood. Okay, now one of the questions that scholars grapple with is, how do we take this? How do we take this kind of attack? And I would say that the conventional reading of this is that Amos is being rhetorical. He's being hyperbolic. He's exaggerating. He's saying that all of you who exploit the poor, all of you who are corrupt, all of you who do things which are socially and legally iniquitous, and yet you keep your rituals meticulously, you keep Shabbat, you keep Yom Tov, you go to shul, you pray, you bring your sacrifices, that's hypocritical. So you can't do the mitzvot that are bein adam lamakom, the mitzvot that are between human beings and God, at the expense of mitzvot that are between human beings. And I would suggest, what I want to argue to you today is that Amos is actually saying something different. This is not just rhetoric. It's not just that Amos is telling you, don't be hypocritical. Rather, what Amos is doing is suggesting that these rituals, the rituals that we practice, and our attachment to rituals actually, or have the potential to enable our interpersonal, our social, our legal sins. Amos is saying that Israel's ritual worship actually perpetuates oppression and corruption. And what I want to try to figure out with you is how. How does this happen? How could it be that ritual feeds into oppression? Now, Amos doesn't spell this out for us in any kind of explicit way, but his description of the Israelite society at this time gives us a few clues. So turn to the next source, and we're going to look at a couple of passages from the opening chapters of Amos, which are called the oracle. Their scholars refer to these as the oracles against the nations, where Amos gives you a series of prophecies, 8 prophecies, 6 of them directed to the Gentile nations of the world, the ones that you are familiar with from your reading of Tanakh. The last 2 are directed to Yehuda and then to Israel. And he follows the same structure. It's almost rhythmic. It's almost poetic. Where I'm just going to read it quickly in Hebrew. Ko amar Hashem, thus says God, al shlosha pish'ei Yisrael, or Ammon, or Moab. For the 3 sins of a particular nation, I would have held back. I would not have punished. But for the 4th sin, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That is why I'm going to rain down punishment on a particular nation. And just to show you kind of an example of the types of sins that we're talking about, if you go to the bottom of the page where it says Amos 1, Amos here is talking to Bnei Ammon, to the Ammonites, and he says, what is the sin? Al bik'am harot ha-gil'ad l'ma'an harchiv et kivulam. Because they ripped open the pregnant women of Gil'ad in order to enlarge their own territory. So here we're talking about some kind of horrific war crime, and it is for this sin that the Ammonites are going to suffer punishment. Let's turn to what the sins are of Israel. Do I have a volunteer to read? The first source on the page, Amos 2. Anybody? Sonia.
Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they sold for silver those whose cost was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. You who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl, and thereby profane my holy name. They recline by every altar on garments taken in pledge, and drink in the house of their God wine with fine fables. Okay, great. So number 1, a couple of points. Israel is just like every other nation. From the point of view of Amos, they're just as bad as everybody else. And you can imagine the Israelites listening to Amos. You think about these prophets as standing up on soapboxes in the middle of Times Square, and you can imagine them listening, and he's attacking their enemies. He's saying the Moabites, the Ammonites, these people are terrible. These people are horrible. And the Israelites are standing there and shaking their heads and saying, yes, we know this already. And then he starts attacking them. And that's when they stop, and you hear this collective gasp. Us? We don't rip open pregnant women. We don't do that kind of thing. And Amos is saying, no, you do. You do the same as everybody else. And more than that, which is also shocking, that we might not expect to hear, is that God expects the same of everybody. All the nations of the world, according to Amos, are held to the same standard. And what's the standard? How they treat the people who live on the margins of society, the vulnerable and the poor. Now, you tell me, so first of all, what's the sin? What is this sin? What's this 4th sin that, for its sake, God will not forgive? How would you characterize the sin? And what does it do? What does it have to do with ritual? Joe.
It sounds like it's a corruption of power, but not in the sense that they're taking advantage of their positions, but they're getting too comfortable in their positions and forgetting why they're there.
Okay, we definitely see a sense of, there's a sense of power, and you're picking up on the fact that at this point in history, Israel was secure. They were militarily secure, and they were materially, financially prosperous. They were doing well. Might make us think about the Jewish community in America, I don't know. But okay, that is Israel at this point, yes. And there's a sense of decadence. There's a sense of, they're reclining, they're drinking wine. But where are they reclining and drinking the wine? In the altar, yeah. So what would you say? So their sin number one is that they are selling the tzaddik for a pair of shoes for silver. They will sell anybody to make money. But what does this have to do with the house of their God? What is it? What?
Corrupt, and then they're using whatever proceeds from their corruption to go worship.
Great. So they're actually bringing their ill-gotten gains into the sanctuary. And they're reclining. Now, what's the law in the Torah about when you can take a garment, when you can take somebody's clothes as a collateral, as a pledge? Somebody owes you money. They promise they'll pay it back. You take their garment as a pledge, their clothing. What's the law? You need to give it to them. You need to give it to them so that they can wear it. Exactly. So here, the people now, maybe it could be that they are doing this legally. Maybe they're reclining on garments in a technically legal way, but there's something obscene about what they're doing. They're taking it into the sanctuary and reclining on it. We'll get to what their mentality is after. Any thoughts about that first? Why somebody might do that? Why somebody might cheat somebody and take the proceeds of their cheating and then bring it into shul? I mean, think about maybe a modern analogy to that.
Makes it kosher.
Okay, it alleviates the guilt. It makes it kosher. Great, yeah.
It allows them to rationalize whatever they're doing.
It allows them, so it rationalizes it, justifies their crime. Can you think, by the way, of like a modern analogy to that, since we're not taking people's clothes as collateral?
Foreclosure.
Oh, I was thinking about something like that. How so? What? Spell it out.
People make money off of other people's sorrows and foreclosing on homes and,
Okay, and maybe, okay, great, good. Yeah?
Stealing food to feed somebody else.
Well, I wouldn't say stealing food to feed somebody else, but maybe stealing food to make a party, and to maybe sponsor the Kiddush and Shul, something like that. I was also thinking about this. I once heard a lecture about this. The halachot associated with who you name buildings for. If you have a plaque in a shul, and then it turns out that the person fraudulently obtained that money, what do you do with the plaque? That's actually a halachic question, which is kind of interesting. Okay, let's turn to the next source. Turn to where it says Amos 8, Amos Perek Chet. Okay, here we have this little glimpse into Israelite society. Somebody else, another volunteer to read. June. English is great.
Listen to this, you who devour the needy, annihilate the poor of the land.
Okay, hold on. I just want to call your attention. The word devour, it's the same word that we saw before, hashoafim, which is translated originally as trample. You who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground. And here, it's same idea. You who trample, you who devour the needy. Good.
Saying, if only the new moon were over, so that we could sell grain, the Sabbath, so that we could offer wheat for sale, using an ephah that is too small and a shekel that is too big, tilting a dishonest scale. Great.
Hold on a second. I also want to call your attention to a little, I think it's an intentional pun. How does he translate, what's the word for annihilating the poor of the land? Look at that carefully. And what's the pun that I think he's Vilashbit Aniyei Aretz? Yeah, and here he's talking, the root Shabbat is in there, and here he's talking about people who are desperately waiting for Shabbat to be over so that they can open up their phones and start doing dishonest business. That's what's going on here. Okay, keep on going.
And selling grain.
Selling grain refuse.
Refuse as grain.
So selling bad merchandise.
You will buy the poor for silver, the needy for a pair of sandals.
Great. Finish. Last pasuk.
Swears by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget any of their doings.
Okay, great. So again, this very kind of, like, we get these like windows into how people are functioning in Israelite society in the 8th century. That this is what people are doing. They are meticulous about their adherence to Shabbat. By the way, it's just an interesting side point. They seem to be meticulous not only about Shabbat, but also about not doing business on Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. If only the new moon were over. It seems that maybe at that time, Rosh Chodesh was also a day where you didn't do any work.
You just
Well,
did dishonest work in Russia.
Right, maybe. So you see these people waiting. They're meticulous about their performance of ritual, and all they want is for the holiday or for Shabbat to end so that they can resume their dishonest practices. By the way, just also an interesting side note, when we think about ritual, when we think about different major categories of ritual, we often think about time and place. And here Amos is kind of tackling both. Here we're talking about the Jewish adherence to time, and before in the first source that we looked at, we were kind of got this window into what these ritualized places look like and to what the sanctuaries look like. So here we have, again, this idea of people who are going to the sanctuaries, they're performing the sacrifices, they're keeping Shabbat, but they are doing so while simultaneously exploiting and oppressing the poor. Now, going back to what people started to say about what the ritual is doing, what role the ritual is serving, I think you got it right. The ritual is the means by which Israel thinks that they will escape punishment. So there's a certain cycle. I cheat the poor, I benefit, I enrich myself by cheating the poor, and then I go straight to the sanctuary, I do my sacrifice, I pray, and I'm inoculated. And this absolves me of my responsibility. And then it goes on and on and on. And the ritual represents a mechanism by which Israel thinks that she can escape punishment. Now, the overwhelming message of Amos is punishment. It's not about salvation. It's not about, there's vague promises of redemption, salvation, but overall, Amos's kind of persistent message is that you are going to be punished. And in that sense, I actually think that he is saying, don't do the ritual. Because the ritual has, number one, become corrosive, and number two, it's the tool, it's the mechanism by which you continue to oppress the poor. You are digging your own grave by performing ritual. So I would imagine that this is a mentality that probably most of us do not identify with. But what I want to spend the last few minutes talking about with you are the ways in which we do rituals, our kind of ritual mentalities that might obstruct our ethical behavior, that might obstruct mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness, from flowing, to use the words of Amos. So any thoughts about that? Or maybe this was an 8th century problem and it's not a 2017 problem.
When you say ritual, do you mean mitzvah also? Is it the same thing?
So that's a great question. For now, I would say ritual are the distinctive, unique practices. They're things that we do which set us apart as a religion and as a nation.
I have a question. Do you believe that they would have been more ethical and proper if they didn't have ritual?
So I'm kind of going to evade that question, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that it brings us to a totally different issue, which is that in the 8th century BCE, nobody could have envisioned life without ritual. Historically, that just didn't make sense. We can envision that. But that was the but at that point in time, nobody thought that. So the way that, for example, Julius Wellhausen, who was one of the first biblical critics, who was a Protestant, the way that he interpreted Amos was basically as advocating for Protestant Christianity, ethics without ritual. But he wrote this in the 1800s. So I think, 1800s. So scholars after Wellhausen said that just would not have worked. Nobody would have thought of a religion without ritual. Ritual was totally built into their everyday life. So that's my very long evasion of your question, which is, we can't even think about. Yeah.
If you cross out ritual and you put in the word Beit Midrash, I think you could draw the analogies to today. I mean, there's a culture of, if you're studying in the Beit Midrash, you're free to do other things that are less.
Okay.
Because you're devoting hours to Gemara, so therefore you've earned the right to do something maybe that's questionable. There is that ethic out there.
There is, okay, good. Yeah, in the back?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing here is a compartmentalization of practice. So the way I practice between me and God, that's sacred. But when it impacts me personally, I'm going to kind of act differently. And I don't think, to Ricky's point, it's limited to the Beit Midrash today. I think it transcends everything we do, where you can't even think of, driving a car on Shabbat. But when it comes to stealing a little here and there, it's it's about priorities.
Okay, so there's a way in which we can do that. I guess what I would push back and ask you is, we compartmentalize. Is there a way in which the ritual performance, our commitment to ritual, could actually facilitate ethical transgressions?
Yes.
Yes.
I saw an ad for have somebody do Shibuah Hakam for you. And I'm just envisioning these people going to find nests and sending the mother away.
The mother bird away.
They don't need, because to do a mitzvah, so they're not being compassionate, trying to fulfill a mitzvah that is supposed to teach compassion, but not being compassionate.
Okay, that's a really interesting example. But I would say that's not exactly within the rubric of what we're talking about, because the very ritual raises questions. In other words, we have to grapple with what the original intent of that mitzvah was and how to do it today in an ethical, socially responsible way. Okay, I want to, how much more time do I have? Like 1 minute, 30 seconds. Okay. I want to make 2 more points, and then if we have time, take a couple more, take more comments. So 2 things that I came up with were, one, the performance of ritual, and this, if you talk to anthropologists, this is the function of ritual. It creates a certain kind of communal cohesion. If you have a family, think about your family rituals. Think about community rituals. Think about religious rituals. Things that we do, and this goes back to Sonia's point about what are the actual features or definitions of a ritual. If you think about things that we do on a consistent kind of rhythmic basis, an outward practice, it creates a certain kind of communal cohesion. So, for example, or family cohesion. My family we have a certain brisket, and we have a certain brisket recipe, which we love to make on very specific occasions. What does that do? it creates a certain kind of bond, a certain kind of familial bond. When we think about our community rituals, everybody doing the same thing at the same time in pretty much the same way. We look inward. It's a way of strengthening who we are as a people, as a family, as a community. And which is amazing, which is magnificent and really important. And it's the only way that I would say Judaism is perpetuated. However, the problem is that we end up looking inward, so much so that we don't look outward. And a friend of mine just used this as an example. She saw this horrifying picture of a malnourished baby in Syria. I don't know if it was circulating on social media. And she registered kind of the necessary mental outrage. She said it took 2 minutes for her to forget about it. She didn't go to sleep thinking about it. She didn't wake up thinking about it. And it was, in retrospect, shocking to her how much she was so kind of involved with her life, her family life, what was going on in her community, that what was going on out in the world just did not cause her to actually move, to actually act. So that's one thing. And the second thing I think that we have to think about, and I don't have the answer to it, is how much time and money and energy rituals cost. If you think about how much money you spend preparing for Shabbat, how much time it takes, how much energy it takes, and at what expense? What does that mean in terms of the money that we're not spending, or the time or the energy that we're not spending alleviating the pain or the suffering of others? And I don't say this obviously to suggest not spending the time, the money, and the energy, but to be conscious of that, to be conscious of maybe making it a little bit more equal. And I think that this is the final point. While I don't have a specific answer to that, to this question of what do we do in order to look outwards, in order to actually contribute, to actually do things for people around the world who are in pain, who are suffering, I think that there are ways in which we can take the positive features of ritual and extend them to our ethical and moral world. And I just wanted to share one example with you. This old friend of mine, his name is Mark Gittler, he founded an organization, you could look it up, it's called Fast for Feast. And basically what the idea is he said, think about how much money you save on a fast day, how much money you don't spend on food, on breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, whatever, for your kids, for your family. And he said, take that money, and the idea is you make a donation to this organization, which in turn takes the money and gives it to organizations that deal with hunger, with food insecurity. And I think what's amazing about this organization is that it's ritualizing basically the very message that Yeshayahu has about that we read on Yom Kippur, that what is a fast day? It's about feeding the hungry. And he's saying you can actually do that on a fast day. You don't just have to not eat. You can actually ritualize feeding people who are hungry. And the other thing that it doesn't only ritualize the action of tzedakah. What it also does is it takes the experience of hunger, which you couldn't get if you didn't perform the ritual of fasting. You wouldn't know what hunger felt like, or one who has access to food doesn't understand what hunger feels like unless they fast. So it takes the power of that experience, it harnesses that power in order to actually help people who struggle with hunger on a day-to-day basis. So I think thinking creatively about ways in which we can merge the ritual world and the ethical world could actually pave the way forward in order to try to build a world more in line with the values of Amos. And thank you. There's a couple of questions. Yeah.
So, with regard to your
Z,
friend,
right?
Yeah. With regard to your friend who didn't lose sleep over the Syrian baby, I think that we're generally selected for kin altruism. I don't necessarily think that someone who doesn't perform ritual would have looked at that baby and then lost sleep or had a very different reaction than your friend, because it's still other. So it just helps identify who is within.
That's a fair critique. I think that's a fair critique. I guess my question would be, are people who are not just committed, but maybe committed to the point of obsessed or extremely devoted to ritual, are those people less likely to keep that picture of the Syrian baby in their head and do something with it? In other words, does ritual, if you're performing ritual in such kind of an intensive and exhaustive way, does it mean that you're looking inward to such a degree that there's really no chance that you would go online and make the appropriate donation? That's my question. It's a fair critique. I don't know what the statistics are. I think it's worthwhile to look into the statistics. Yeah.
Are you making the equation between intensely performed rituals and the extent to which people make them into magic? Because I can imagine someone who's intense about their ritual but hasn't transformed the ritual into something mechanical. And
right.
I don't know that that person's at risk to the ethical. And I can imagine someone who's not so intense about their ritual but views them as mechanical tools and drops the ethical.
So I think that you're right, that for Amos that was the problem. That there was a sense of automaticity. I don't know if that's the right word. There was a sense in which ritual was automatic. I think it's also same question. I would same type of question in the sense that I still think that that ritual by its very nature can pose that challenge. I don't think that it's necessarily the case, obviously. I think there are, plenty of people, maybe, who perform rituals who are not at risk, or who that doesn't happen with them, where they're not so inward leaning and they're not only kind of looking towards their own group to the extent that they can ignore what's happening outside. But I think it's a challenge, and I think it's a potential obstacle that we should be aware of. That's how I would put it. Yeah.
So Rambam writes in Shabbat, chapter 2, I think, that the purpose of all the mitzvot in the Torah is to bring a person to acts of kindness and to bring peace in the world.
Yes.
So that would argue against a lot of what we heard tonight. The idea is that I'm shaking my lulav as meditating that I'm going to bring goodness to the world.
Agreed.
And trying to do those ritualistic things to bring yourself to become a better, more ethical person. So
I would say that Amos is he's an iconoclast. It's not surprising to me that if the Rambam and Amos were in a room together, that they would get into an argument. So I think that's a different approach to ritual. I would say that the Rambam, in some ways, that's an ideal. Yes, if only every ritual we performed did that. I'm not sure that it does on the real day-to-day level. Ezra, last question.
It's kind of similar to what I think people say. So what's the value of ritual? In other words, we're hearing why it's not, ties to the corruption or whatever, so we're very ritual-oriented
people.
It comes from God, through the Torah, it comes through our rabbis, through the Shana. So what's the value of it? Because it seems like the value of it was minimized through what you were saying.
So I think that number one, what I said about the ties that it creates is I mean, there's like one of these kind of off-the-cuff comments, more than, I think it's a Yiddish writer, but I don't know for sure, more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish, something like that, where I think that, I don't think we would be here today without ritual. And I think that what Jack said is also really significant, that it does have the power, there is a certain ethical utility in ritual.
It's done right.
If it's done right. If it's done right with a certain mentality. I think that we're accustomed to seeing ritual as something that we do, and I think that we should be aware of what the limits of it are and what the opportunities of it are, and that's what I hope came across. Thank you.